up on New Day at Arirang. With delays in the confirmation process for President Yoon's cabinet nominees, South Korea's new government will hold its first cabinet meeting in the coming hours with several members of the now former Moon administration. The new Yoon Suk-yeol government marks the beginning of the so-called Yongsan era, as is established to keep Yoon's campaign pledge of being closer to the people. The UN Security Council is set to convene Wednesday to discuss North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. The meeting comes as the U.S. is pushing the Council to strengthen sanctions on the regime.
Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's Wednesday, May 11th, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Oh Soo-young.
And I'm Yongsan Presidency. Thanks again for joining us this morning, because over the next hour, we'll be giving you the biggest headlines of the day and experts' insights on some of the key issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. Now, our top story this morning, a new South Korean president is sworn in. Of course, Yoon Suk-yeol's inaugural ceremony focusing on communication and the people.
And he indeed walked the talk as he made his way to the stage on foot, greeting members of the public along the way, fist bumping and posing for photos. Our Yoon Jung-min starts us off.
The 20th presidential inauguration ceremony held at the National Assembly focused on communication with ordinary citizens, children, and marginalized people. President Yoon Suk-yeol on Tuesday went up to the podium with 20 representatives of the people, including Squid Game actor Oh Young-soo and a descendant of an early U.S. missionary, David Linton. Taking to the podium, President Yoon and First Lady Kim Gon-hee greeted and shook hands with former President Moon Jae-in and former First Lady Kim Jong-suk. The new president then greeted former President Park Geun-hye. After he took the oath of office, an honor guard gave President Yoon a 21-gun salute. In the crowd were tens of thousands of ordinary people whose applications were chosen in a lottery.
I'm glad and honored to come to the inauguration ceremony and see the new president, whether up close or far away.
I don't know much about politics, so I came here for an experience. It's my first time coming to an inauguration, so I'll see how it goes.
Instead of performances by big stars, there were a children's musical and a performance by an orchestra. And during the event, a big screen showed the opening of the Blue House to tourists. Foreign dignitaries were also there, including Singaporean President Halima Yacob, Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan, the U.S. Second Gentleman Douglas Emhoff, and Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi, to name a few. Also present were the wife of former President Lee Myung-bak, the families of former South Korean presidents, as well as politicians and lawmakers. From the business world, there were Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong, SK Group Chairman Choi Tae-won, and Hyundai Motor Group Chairman Chung Ui-sun. Above all, the key component of the 20th presidential inauguration ceremony was the people. Upon arrival, President Yoon and the First Lady got out of their car at the main gate of the National Assembly and walked to the podium so that the president could meet and greet the people. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Under Yoon Suk-yeol, the presidential office will no longer be at Cheongwade. The new South Korean leader broke decades of tradition, relocating from the secluded grounds to an office in the central town of Yongsan in Seoul to keep his campaign pledge of being closer to the people. Lee Kyung-eun has this full story.
Security is much tighter now at what used to be South Korea's Defense Ministry compound, as it is now officially turned into the presidential office. At its main building now hangs the presidential symbol, the phoenix and the national flower. And on the day he took office, President Yoon Suk-yeol officially declares the start to the Yongsan Presidency.
우리 국민이 다 함께 잘 사는 이 나라를 위해서 우리가 한번 신나게 일해 봅시다. 자, 같이 하실 거죠?
The relocation is all part of Yoon's efforts to better interact with the public. And that's exactly what he did on his way to his office here, greeting the neighborhood's senior citizens and children. The office Yoon will be using for the time being is the 5th floor. He will start using the main office from next month once the remodeling is over. A large chunk of the building will be used by a private-public partnership committee, in line with Yoon's efforts to increase participation from private sector experts in policy making. Reporters are also located in the same building, which wasn't the case at the Blue House, for better communication with the public. At midnight prior to the inauguration, Yoon visited the underground bunker where the National Crisis Management Center is located to take his first military briefing as the new commander-in-chief. It's a move by Yoon to prove that there is no security risk resulting from the relocation of the presidential office. Issues on security, costs, and logistics had once prompted concerns over the relocation. But Yoon insisted he will not use the Blue House as he vowed to take the office of the president away from the secluded Blue House to become a more interactive leader while returning the Blue House fully to the public.
결단하지 않으면 제왕적 대통령제에서 벗어나기 어렵습니다. 일단 이 공관이 의식을 지배한다고 저는 생각합니다.
That was the #1 election pledge Yoon made on the first day of his campaign. And this is the very first election campaign promise Yoon has kept on the day he took office. 이경은, Arirang News.
And on top of President Yoon Suk-yeol's agenda for Wednesday morning is the first ever meeting of his chief secretaries. The supplementary budget bill for COVID-19 relief, worth some 35 trillion Korean won, or close to $27.5 billion US, is expected to be discussed. Yoon's first cabinet meeting is set to convene on Thursday to vote on this item. During Wednesday's meeting, the appointment of cabinet members is also expected to be discussed. 5 of Yoon's minister nominees' positions have yet to be finalised, while there may have even been a new minister named before the cabinet meeting.
Now, of course, President Yoon focused much of his work on diplomacy. He did welcome the U.S. delegation as the very first guest at his new office and voiced hopes of working closely with Japan as well. Kim Da-mi with this report.
President Yoon Suk-yeol spent much of his first day as South Korean leader engaged in diplomacy. He welcomed the U.S. delegation led by the second gentleman, Douglas Emhoff, as the first guest to his new office in Yongsan, where he said the Seoul-Washington alliance is the most successful alliance America has. Emhoff further underlined that U.S. President Joe Biden is looking forward to visiting South Korea next week.
And I understand this will be the earliest meeting between a new ROK president and the President of the United States in history. President Biden has asked that I personally deliver this letter to you, expressing his congratulations and desire to work with you over the next 5 years.
Calling Seoul a cooperative partner of Beijing, China's Vice President Wang Qishan said Chinese leader Xi Jinping invites Yoon to China at a time that is convenient for both sides. He also reiterated China's support for improved inter-Korean ties. Yoon also greeted Japan's Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi on his first visit to South Korea, voicing hope they can work together with Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to improve Seoul-Tokyo ties.
I sincerely congratulate President Yoon on his inauguration. First of all, I will deliver a letter from Japan's Prime Minister Kishida.
Also congratulating Yoon, Singaporean leader Halima Yacob, and the delegation from the UAE stressed the importance of bilateral ties and deeper cooperation with Seoul under the Yoon administration. Yoon then ended his first day as president with a traditional Korean dinner reception with foreign guests at Silla Hotel in Changchung-dong, Central Seoul. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Now, as South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol urged for North Korean denuclearization in his inauguration speech, the U.S. reiterated that the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a shared goal of Seoul and Washington. Now, the remarks comes as the UN Security Council is set to convene an emergency meeting to address North Korean issues at the request of the United States. Kim Yong-sun has more.
Washington has once again reaffirmed that completely denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula is a common goal of South Korea and the U.S. State Department Press Secretary Ned Price, speaking at a press briefing Tuesday, said the two allies will continue to coordinate closely on ways to achieve their common objective. The remarks were made when he was asked about South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration speech, where Yoon said that his government will help revive Pyongyang's economy if the regime gives up its nuclear ambitions. Price further explained that the U.S. looks forward to continuing discussions when President Biden visits Seoul next week for a summit with Yoon. This comes as the U.S. says the North is expected to continue advancing its nuclear and missile capabilities this year with the aim of increasing its leverage in any potential talks with Washington. In a global threat assessment report submitted to the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee before a budget hearing, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines explained that the regime continues to produce fissile materials, including plutonium and uranium programs for nuclear weapons. Against this backdrop, the U.S. has made a request to the UN Security Council to convene an emergency meeting to address North Korea's latest missile launches. According to multiple news outlets, including AFP, the UNSC is set to hold an open meeting later Wednesday to discuss North Korean issues. Kim Yeo-san, Arirang News.
US President Joe Biden is due to visit South Korea and Japan this month. And it seems likely that the formal launch of the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, may take place then. Speaking virtually at an event in the US on Monday, Japan's ambassador to the US, Koji Tomita, said that Washington and Tokyo have been working out the details. He added that Biden's visit to Japan may signal that the US remains heavily focused on Indo-Pacific matters, despite Russia's war on Ukraine. The IPEF is a US-led effort to build strong ties and supply chains in the Asia-Pacific while freezing out China. Last year, the US says it plans to launch the IPEF in early 2022, but that was pushed back due to a delay in the negotiations. South Korea has already said it wants to join, with the framework also expected to include Australia, New Zealand and Singapore.
And now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into key issues in the spotlight right now. Of course, the Federal Reserve last Wednesday raised its benchmark interest rate by 0.5 percentage point in a bid to tame inflation. Now, the rate hike marked the biggest increase in 22 years.
And with the widely expected move, the Fed set its target federal funds rate to a range between 0.75% and 1%. But will this be enough to tame the ever-rising inflation, and how will this be reflected in the Bank of Korea's decisions? To find out, we connect with Oh Ji-oh, Associate Professor at the Business School at Hanyang University in Seoul. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Professor Oh. And, well, my first question to you really is that this rate hike was very much anticipated, but was it the right timing in your opinion?
First of all, pleasure to be on the program. I remember coming on this exact program a few months ago, and we were talking about, whether the Fed would increase rate by 0.25 percentage points 3 times, 4 times, 5 times back in November, December. But times have changed, and back then we were talking about inflation rising year on year by about 5 to 6%. And the latest data from March of 2022 shows that inflation just continues to be rising at a faster pace. It reached 8.5%, which is the highest rate for over 40 years, and not since 1981. So the Fed's more aggressive approach, though widely expected, is their, I wouldn't say belated, but their sort of response, much needed response towards taming all these inflationary expectations that seem to be fast running away.
So, Professor Oh, obviously for many, especially homeowners, having interest rates hike is going to be a big concern. But as long as it kind of tames the inflationary pressure, I'm sure everyone will be okay. But I guess with that being said, the big question is this enough to kind of ease the inflationary pressure that we've been seeing?
That's a question that remains to be seen. Jerome Powell and the Fed committee members initially thought this would be a transient thing. But then a lot has changed. We didn't anticipate Ukraine war. We didn't anticipate all these new variants continuing to exert the pace of reopening and all this inflationary pressure on wages and everything. So one thing that I would really look out for in the short term is that towards the end of this week, the April inflation numbers for the US will be released. There's a bit of disagreement here, but I would say the majority of the opinion are cautiously optimistic that inflation may have peaked, that on year, they're expecting it to be somewhere between 8 to 8.1%. So seeing some sign of inflation going down would obviously factor into how the Fed behaves over the next, say, 6 to 9 months. But as things stand, there's just a lot of uncertainties, especially with the war, with the fuel prices and everything. So all I can say for the moment is it really remains to be seen.
And with all this uncertainty, Professor A, how do you think the Fed's rate, its pace of rate hikes is really going to affect the Bank of Korea's decisions?
Right. So the inflation hasn't just been about the US. So we've just got the numbers for the April 2022 for Korean CPI. So Korea's CPI also rose by 4.8%, which is a lot faster than its 2% target. So Bank of Korea also has its own work to do as well. And, not responding to the Fed's interest rate moves has various repercussions on the exchange rate, for example. Over the past couple of months, exchange rate the won has been weakening significantly against the dollar. So that puts the Bank of Korea in a precarious position, and I think that at least this FOMC meeting was widely expected and factored in, so it will likely continue its own course of rate hikes. But I expect the Bank of Korea to continue on with monetary tightening throughout the year.
So, I mean, going back here in the country once again, like you said, if the BOK is widely expected to continue to increase its rate hikes, obviously it's going to ease the inflations a bit. But on the flip side, we still have to look at the economic impacts, the negative impacts that it is going to cause. So what would be some of them that, I guess, everyday citizens will face because of all this?
Well, I mean, we have the most important thing here is that we have become so accustomed to cheap money over the past decade or so. People have been building up debt either against their house or their credit, and been investing. And Nasdaq for the past week or so have been doing quite badly. So there will be various repercussions on the asset market side as well. But the one thing that I'm mostly worried about is obviously the housing market. Because of the house prices that have been skyrocketing over the past few years, people have been building a lot of debt against it and then buying houses. The interest rates on those loans are expected to increase substantially. And it's not out of the question we'll be seeing 6-7% for even like prime housing loans by the end of the year. So people that that contracted into these loans at 2-3%, they're going to have a hard time adjusting, and household consumption, consequently, will likely suffer sadly as a result.
Thank you very much, Professor Oh Ji-hyo of Hanyang University, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Well, that's going to conclude the first half of New Day at Arirang.
That's right, but stick around. We have more in part 2, so we'll be back in just a moment.
Now, the global economy is expected to improve slightly this year.
And have all dropped, but future economic indicators weren't so positive.
Faster growth in emerging
U.S.-China trade deal may be near, while a rally in global
For an economic outlook of South Korea's economy for 2020, we get a preview now from our business correspondent.
Arirang, what matters?
possible. LiDAR technology is being used to improve accuracy.
It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. The Yoon Suk-yeol government's economic policy team will launch on Wednesday, officially, a day after the South Korean president's inauguration. And as they get to work, they're faced with very difficult tasks. They need to salvage an economy that is grappling with not only the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, trade disturbances and soaring inflation, like most countries around the world, but also structural issues that have worsened income polarization, housing prices and prospects for jobs, as well as future productivity. So how will they address these challenges, and what should be done to tackle these structural issues that have long plagued the Korean economy? For this, we connect with Kim Se-wan, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University, and Troy Stangeron, Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Very warm welcome to you both. Well, Professor Kim, my first question going to you. South Korea's new finance minister, Chu Kyung-ho, his first task is going to be a rather big one. It's going to be rolling out a supplementary budget, or introducing it at least, for a lot of small business owners in South Korea who have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. Now, what do you think this supplementary bill is going to look like, and to what extent do you think it's going to bring relief?
Even with 4% economic growth last year, Korean economy is not fully recovered from coronavirus pandemic yet. And the hardest hit by the pandemic is self-employers and small business owners, particularly in service sector. So far, government supports on self-employers and small business owners is about 35.1 trillion won from the beginning of, from the outbreak of pandemic. But it is far below their business losses of about 54 trillion won. So it is necessary to provide a certain form of economic relief to these people. President Yoon's government's plan to provide cash support through an extra budget of about 35 trillion won. The details about this plan and how to finance this project will be announced sometime late this week. During the election campaign, actually, President Yoon promised to spend around 50 trillion won to compensate the self-employed for their losses caused by tougher COVID-19 curbs.
So indeed, in order to address these concerns, the everyday lives of the South Korean people, Yoon's team has, during the transition period, constantly emphasized the need to improve people's livelihoods. But Mr. Stangeron, there are still some concerns that with Yoon's party being traditionally pro-business, they might overlook some social welfare elements. Do you think they will pay enough attention to improving people's livelihoods? And what are the key areas that you think they need to prioritize?
So when we look at the structural issues that the Yoon administration faces in South Korea, some of these are in the labor market, some of these are in the recovery from the pandemic, and some of these go back to issues related simply to the dual nature of South Korea's own labor market. But when we look at this, what we come to the conclusion for is that, as Dr. Kim said, SMEs have been hit the hardest, specifically single owners. And so the pledge to take and provide support to them is important. But the Yoon administration will need to look and ask, how do we take and help larger firms, larger SMEs take and become large firms? How do we grow these firms so that way they don't stagnate? And that's going to be one of the key things to taking and trying to take and resolve this issue. Two, how do we take and open up the labor market? South Korea traditionally has had a dual labor market, and that's made it challenging for young people who often face difficulties in getting good jobs to get good jobs. How do we make it more efficient in the labor market? We saw during the pandemic, there were challenges because of the dual labor market in terms of efficiently allocating workers out to different jobs and back into the economy. And so we need to see how do we deal with that. But at the same time, you also have issues of how do you create new jobs in new industries? And the Yoon administration has put forward proposals to take and loosen regulations. Some of those will be good, but we also need to remember that sometimes regulations actually spur innovation, that they don't always hinder innovation. And a good example of this is climate change and energy. If you loosen climate change goals, you're likely to see simply a return to fossil fuels. MIT is a new report out that suggests that Korea is actually one of the more innovative economies when it comes to green technology. This might actually stifle a potential growth area and one that would create jobs for people in South Korea. So how do you balance innovation and regulation together? And in terms of broader social welfare, Park and Hae took and increased the pensions for retirees. We saw an increase under Moon Jae-in. Korea still has some of the highest levels of old age poverty. So I think this is something that the Yoon administration will need to address, and there is a history within their own party of actually doing that as well.
And Professor Kim, well, there has been some criticism that the previous Moon administration didn't spend enough on small businesses and ordinary people at the right time during the pandemic with its supplementary budget plans. But right now, there are fears that South Korea's level of debt is getting unmanageable, with its debt to GDP ratio expected to reach a record high of 50.1% this year. And, well, some experts, though, they've voiced concern that the biggest supplementary budget ever to come, that's going to worsen the situation. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's the tough question, but President Yoon's government should be carefully set the policy priority between supporting people with government money and recovering fiscal health. Korean government is projected to see the fiscal deficit sharply increase this year and next year in the wake of several times of supplementary budget. This expanding government's expenditure makes national debts possibly break through 1,100 trillion won mark, or over 50% of GDP this year. It means that conditions are not suitable to issue new bonds to stimulate the Korean economy. But at the same time, it should be recognized that it is government expenditure that has a power to revive Korean economy as of now. Since recovering Korean economy, which has been highlighted by President Yoon, means higher income and more jobs, President Yoon's government would put higher priority on economic stimulus through government's spending than the physical health.
Professor Kim, another question to you. Now, another huge economic challenge that the new government faces is housing prices. And of course, the previous administration tried and failed over 24 times to cool the overheated market, but clearly failed, of course. But the question is it even possible at this point? And what do you think Yoon's economic team plans to do differently?
It looks that one of the toughest challenges of President Yoon's government would be stabilizing housing market. To new government, there are two pillars of housing market policy. One is providing more mortgages, loans to the real house buyers like young and newly married people with favorable conditions at interest rate. Another is providing more apartment in major metro areas, but providing mortgages at lower interest rate can further raise the housing price. And constructing apartment is a massive size, takes a long time, over 3 to 5 years. It means then, against new government's intention, there are quite a few uncertainties in housing market. But if new government is successful in mixing these two policies without stimulating housing demand, the housing price increase would be limited.
And Mrs. Stangrone, during the transition period, President Yoon's team, they announced a plan for a digital revolution by updating the country's platforms to spur data innovation among citizens, businesses and also government bodies. And well, past governments have actually announced very similar sounding data revolution plans. So do you think this one is going to be any different? I mean, what needs to be done to fundamentally resolve South Korea's lack of innovation ventures?
This is actually fairly ambitious in President Yoon wanted to take and actually put together essentially a one-stop shop for government data to where any citizen could access all of their information in one spot. It's going to require a lot of coordination across departments, across ministries, across different sectors, and also input from the private sector on how you do this and questions on legality in terms of what actually is perhaps private data that couldn't be shared across ministries. So you're going to have these issues that are going to have to be worked through. But in terms of focusing on big data and artificial intelligence, which is a continuation of the prior Moon administration's focus, I think these are really critical for the country going forward. How you take and pull together data to take and have new innovations, be they either drug research we saw during the pandemic, artificial intelligence helped South Korea to take and develop one of the first test kits for COVID-19. So it's important when you need speed to go through data. Artificial intelligence will help you analyze that data, and you need to have the stores of data to do that. And so this is going to be a challenge for the administration going forward, but it's going to be key for the economy in the future.
Right, a lot of regulatory challenges as well. And well, Professor Kim, now, President Yoon, when he took the oath of office yesterday, his speech mentioned the need for a rapid, sustainable growth for the Korean economy. And there seemed to be a sense of urgency in saying this, in safeguarding South Korea's economic security. How do you think the Yoon administration is going to go about in order to boost Korea's capacity to really ramp up its economic growth?
Well, the new government will employ all available policy tools in boosting up Korean economy in the short run. But here comes a complex economic situation even before initiating new policies. Korean economy is suffering already from super high inflation, lukewarm domestic consumption and investment, and global production chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine and so on. So new government should be implementing their own policies while controlling these difficulties, mostly originated from foreign countries. It means that new government needs to be flexible enough to compromise all these difficulties while boosting up economic growth in the short run. So it's going to be a tough work.
And Mr. Stangrone, now South Korea's trade, with the country being a heavily trade-dependent nation, is going to have to do some careful balancing when it comes to its trade ties with China. It's still in a very sticky situation as the Chinese market is very hard to replace given the sheer size of it. And to what extent do you think South Korea will be able to decouple from China, and what can Seoul do in order to bolster its economic security given the geopolitical circumstances?
I think this is a challenge the United States faces, every country in the world faces. How do you take and minimize your exposure to China while also taking and benefiting from the market? And this is where the economic security component comes in. What key industries do we need to take and ensure that we have alternative suppliers to where China is the primary supplier today? So if we look, for example, at EV batteries, an area where South Korea is a leader, where they're partnering with U.S. automobile manufacturers to develop electronic vehicles, most of the rare earth minerals, things like lithium, cobalt, and other minerals that go into these batteries are either processed in China, about 70% or more of them are all processed in China, or the mines for them are actually controlled, in the case of, like, for example, cobalt, primarily by Chinese firms in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's going to be about how do we take and develop alternative structures to take and gain access to the minerals and the refining in other parts of the world or in South Korea itself. So that way, not that you pull completely out of the Chinese market, but that you minimize your exposure. So that way, if you have a future situation to where China decides to place and put informal sanctions on South Korea or someone else, there are alternative providers who can provide the materials that the firms will need. And so I think it's more about how do you take and create this, safety net, if you will, for supply chains, as opposed to taking and actually really decoupling from China itself.
And Mr. Stangroin, South Korea aims to join the Japan-led mega free trade deal, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's also widely expected to partake in the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as well, which is widely expected to launch this month. And how vital is it for South Korea to join these kind of initiatives? And do you see any possibility of progress on these fronts when President Yoon meets with President Biden and possibly the Japanese Prime Minister as well this month?
I think it's important for South Korea in both. When we talk about the CPTPP, the discussion is often about tariffs, and sometimes people will raise the issue of South Korea already having FTAs with many of these countries. Now, obviously, Japan is well, in RCEP now they have one with Japan as well, but had been the one large exception previously. But CPTPP is really about setting the rules. And what we know in terms of trade is that it's important to have good, strong rules. And so I think for South Korea, a country who's dependent on trade, it's important to be in agreements that reinforce global trading standards and rules. Now, when we look at the the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, still needs to be fleshed out by the Biden administration. But areas like supply chains will be important. And one of the things that I think will be key here is, as I mentioned, it's about taking and analyzing our supply chains, determining how we can create alternative supply chains to take and ensure that during future pandemics, during future wars, during future periods of economic coercion, there are alternative sources to take and provide the supplies and inputs that are needed for farms to be able to produce the goods that they're currently producing. And this is one of the things that I think is important for the United States as well to think about, is that we often focus in the United States on semiconductors. But semiconductors have vast supply chains. And so working through how we ensure that these supply chains are secure and that we have the economic security we need both in South Korea and the United States is going to be a critical part of this type of cooperation.
And just before we wrap up, Professor Kim, as South Koreans still grapple with the economic impact of the pandemic, as well as the long-standing issues that we had in the economy, which really cost dim prospects for the domestic situation. What do you hope to see from Yoon's economic policy team to genuinely improve the livelihoods of the South Korean people?
One of the 6 goals of new government is a global leading nation that contributes to freedom, peace, and prosperity. So for gaining and maintaining leadership in global economy, there should be structural reform in Korean industries, which is not easy. For example, with tasks such as securing an overwhelming lead in semiconductor, artificial intelligence, and battery, and other future strategic industries, conventional industries in manufacturing should be reconstructed by adopting these technologies. It also generates a certain level of social unrest in doing so. So it is required for new government to know how to mediate collisions of economic interest between different parts of the economy.
Well, I'm afraid that's where we must leave it today. Thank you very much, Professor Kim Se-won at Ewha Women's University and Director Troy Stangroin at the Korea Economic Institute of America for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Now, U.S. gasoline prices reached another record high on Tuesday amid the ongoing Ukraine war, which continues to roil global oil markets. According to data from the American Automobile Association, the average cost of a gallon of regular fuel hit $4.37 as of Tuesday. That's the highest ever, not adjusting for inflation, surpassing the previous record high of $4.33 per gallon set in March, soon after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, pundits say that the typical rise in U.S. gasoline prices in the summer months, mixed with volatility in global oil prices, is not a good sign for relief at the pump. Now, South Korea has a very unique age system as opposed to the universal age system where it has created confusions in the past. And to minimize such confusions, there are currently movements to unify the age system here in Korea. Lee Si-hoo with this report.
In Korea, there are 3 ways of counting one's age. First, there's the universal age, where babies are 0 years old at birth and gain a year every birthday. This method has been the official way to count age in most legal definitions and administrations since 1962. Then, there is another official way called 연나이, or literally annual age, in which babies are also aged 0 at birth but gain a year every January 1st. This method is used to define legal age for certain areas of law, such as military conscription or juvenile protection. And then there's 세는 나이, or counting age, commonly known as Korean age. In this method, a baby is considered a year old at birth and gains a year every January 1st.
For me, it's a little difficult because I have to count first. But I think it's an interesting way of counting your age. I think it's very special about Korea.
There are many theories about the origin of South Korea's system of counting age, which in the past was also used in other countries, such as China and Japan. Experts say the lunar calendar used in Asia has had an influence. Using the lunar calendar, people's birthdays change every year. This made it easier to add a year to one's age every year instead of on a person's birthday. While other countries abandoned the system over time, the Korean language with honorifics made it difficult to do so.
In case of the universal age, a person's age changes depending on the birthday, but that's not the case with the Korean age. Instead, everyone ages together on January 1st. This keeps the titles and honorifics consistent.
But the coexistence of different age systems has caused confusion, such as when dealing with COVID-19 vaccinations, Korea's wage peak system, and insurance policies. That's why recently, the Presidential Transition Committee pushed for the widespread use of universal age.
With one unified age counting system, it would be easier to figure things out. It would lessen confusion in contracts and administration and reduce associated social and economic costs.
The Ministry of Government Legislation is planning to submit an amendment to the current General Act on Public Administration to the National Assembly within this year. This would define universal age as the official age system used in all legal and administrative matters and would also encourage its use in unofficial settings as well. 이시후, Arirang News.
Now, as mentioned in the previous report, with the Yoon administration scrapping the Korean age, South Koreans will soon become a year or two younger. Then how are Koreans viewing this new age system and what kind of changes are expected? Our Song Yoo-jin provides a closer look.
South Korea's 20th President Yoon Suk-yeol was sworn into office on Tuesday. As part of his campaign pledge, President Yoon promised to scrap the Korean age system and adopt the universal age, citing the, quote, social and economic costs resulting from using multiple age systems. So how do Koreans feel about this change?
I think using universal age will bring confusion. In Korea, people call each other differently depending on who is older. If I meet a person who is the same age as me now but whose birthday is next week, what should I call her after her birthday?
However, there are also those who welcome the change.
I didn't notice this when I was younger, but whenever I change jobs, employers are concerned about my age. So I'm happy about becoming a year or two younger.
With South Koreans showing both anticipation and skepticism towards adopting the universal age system, what will be different once the change takes effect?
The new age system is expected to guarantee clear communication, but there are obstacles that lie ahead as well.
Domestically, unifying the age system will provide a set age standard for administrative and welfare services. From a global perspective, signing or interpreting contracts that include age will be easier. However, laws that affect a significant portion of the population, such as military service and juvenile protection laws, have been using annual age. To minimize administrative inefficiency, both expert and public opinion will need to be heard before a decision is made.
In order for the new age system to take root properly, efforts by the government are also needed.
The government should play an active role in helping South Koreans become familiar with using universal age. For one, it could create easy-to-understand content such as webtoons that highlight the benefits of the new age system.
Aiming to unify the age system by next year, the Yoon administration will start by establishing relevant codes under the General Act on Public Administration. 송유진, Arirang News.
Now, for a look at news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning to you, Matthew.
Good morning to you guys.
Hi, Matthew. Let's start in Afghanistan, where a new rule announced by the Taliban has led to protests.
That's right. Taking to the streets on Tuesday, women in the country protested recent restrictions imposed by the administration. Now, this follows a ruling made by the Taliban supreme leader on Saturday, decreeing that Afghan women must cover their faces. Now, the move signals an escalation in restrictions on women in public and comes amid growing backlash from many Afghans and the international community. While most women in the country wear a headscarf for religious reasons, many in urban areas don't cover their faces. In recent months, the Taliban also introduced rules on women traveling without a male chaperone, alongside a ban on men and women visiting parks at the same time. Now, this despite assurances from the group that they have changed since their previous repressive period in power. Authorities in Armenia have detained 61 anti-government protesters. The arrests were made on Tuesday in the capital Yerevan at a march that saw hundreds of people demand the resignation of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. While initial footage showed a peaceful demonstration, video taken later revealed police making forceful arrests. There have been a string of protests in recent weeks as pressure mounts on the PM, with at least 92 protesters detained late last week. Now, Pashinyan is under fire for agreeing to a ceasefire brokered by Russia in 2020, when Armenia was defeated by Azerbaijan, losing territory around a disputed region. The United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday elected the Czech Republic to its Human Rights Council, replacing Russia. Russia was suspended from the council last month, 2 years into a 3-year term, over the invasion of Ukraine and allegations of horrific human rights violations. The Czech Republic will complete that period on the council instead, although it cannot make legally binding decisions. Receiving 157 votes in favor while 23 countries abstained, the Czech Republic will start its term immediately. The Human Rights Council is slated to hold a session on Ukraine on Thursday, following a request by Kyiv for a review of the situation there. Tesla CEO Elon Musk has said he would reverse Twitter's ban on former US President Donald Trump if he completes his takeover bid. Speaking virtually Tuesday at a car conference organized by the Financial Times, Musk called the ban a mistake that, quote, alienated the country. Twitter permanently banned Trump in January 2021 over repeated rule violations. The platform also cited the risk of inciting further violence following riots at the US Capitol on 6 January 2021 as part of its decision. Trump has previously said he would not return to Twitter and will instead use his own Truth Social platform. Andy Warhol's 1964 portrait of Marilyn Monroe has sold for $195 million at an auction in New York City. Monday's sale is a record for a piece by an American artist, breaking the previous record set in 2017, when a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat sold for $110.5 million. Now, Shot Shade Blue Marilyn is one of a series of portraits Warhol made of the actress following her death in 1962, and is one of pop art's best-known pieces. Now, under hammer price, the portrait sold for $170 million, with fees adding on an extra $25 million.
Hello, I'm Lee Ji-young with the latest weather update. We are expecting early summer warmth this afternoon, and especially those in the south will notice much higher readings with warm southerly winds this afternoon. Cloud coverage to begin the day, and Jeju will see up to 10 millimeters of rainfall through the afternoon, while the south coast could see some drizzle during the day. Morning temperatures are 2 to 5 degrees higher than the same time yesterday, and air quality will be normal to good across Korea. And highs will be 2 to 4 degrees higher this afternoon. Seoul going up to 24 degrees. Daegu, Gwangju topping out at 27 degrees Celsius. Well, highs in Seoul will be hiking up to 28 degrees Celsius tomorrow. Lots of clouds will dominate the rest of the week with warmer highs. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That wraps up our newscast for this morning, but we will be back tomorrow for our Thursday edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks for tuning in. We have more updates throughout the day, so until then, have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and as always, take care.
환영합니다. 웰컴 투 대구.
양배누아 대구.
하이 라이 따치오.
대구니 요코소.
알람피 대구.
Bienvenido a Daegu.
Welcome you all for the first